I never thought I'd work with the woman who ruined my marriage. Honestly, if someone had told me this a year ago, I would have laughed in their face or maybe cried. My name is Maya, and this is the story of how betrayal almost destroyed me until I found a way to turn it into power. It started like any ordinary day. I woke up next to Ethan, my husband of 5 years. He smiled at me the way he always did, kissed my forehead, and said, "You're my everything, Maya." And I believed him. God, I really did. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. We had what looked like a perfect marriage, at least from the outside. A beautiful apartment overlooking the city skyline. Career goals that people envied. Social media posts that screamed couple goals. But behind those pictures and smiles, cracks had already begun to form. It started small, late-night work calls, missed dinners, and excuses about urgent client meetings. I wanted to trust him. Love makes you blind, doesn't it? You tell yourself the lies because they're easier to live with than the truth. Until one night, the truth found me. I was cleaning out Ethan's study when his phone buzzed. Normally, I wouldn't look. I respected his privacy. But something in me hesitated. The screen lit up, and there it was, a message that froze my heart. "Can't wait to see you again tonight. Same hotel." My chest tightened. I scrolled through, hands trembling. Message after message, full of words that used to belong to me. The pet names, the jokes, the promises. And then a photo, her photo. A woman I didn't recognize. Beautiful, confident, smiling like she had everything she wanted. And apparently, she did my husband. I dropped the phone. My knees gave out. The world spun around me. Every laugh we'd shared, every promise he'd made, it all turned to ashes in that moment. That night, when Ethan came home, I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I needed to see where the truth ended and the lies began. So I played along, smiled, cooked dinner, listened to him talk about his busy day. But deep down, something inside me shifted. The Maya who trusted, who loved blindly, who believed in forever, she was gone. In her place stood a woman who wanted the truth and justice. For days, I couldn't get that woman's face out of my mind. Who was she? Did she even know about me, or was she part of his game? I decided to find out. With a mix of anger and curiosity, I started digging. Ethan had once synced his work emails to our shared laptop, and luckily, he'd forgotten to log out. I found hotel receipts, dinner reservations, and one recurring name, Clara. That was her. Clara. A marketing consultant. New client. That's what Ethan had called her once during dinner, like it was nothing. I looked her up online. She was successful, sharp, and stunning. The kind of woman other women secretly feel intimidated by. But when I saw her smile in one of her profile photos, it didn't look fake or wicked. It looked warm, real. I couldn't shake off a strange thought. Maybe she didn't know either. So I did something I never imagined I would. I messaged her. It was short. "Hi, Clara. We need to talk. It's about Ethan." I expected anger, denial, or silence. Instead, her reply came just minutes later. "Where can we meet?" We met at a quiet cafe downtown. I remember the way she looked at me, nervous, curious, maybe even scared. And when I told her I was Ethan's wife, her face turned pale. Wife, she whispered. Yes, his wife of 5 years. She looked down, shaking her head. He told me he was divorced. Said you were out of the picture. I swear I didn't know. The sincerity in her eyes caught me off guard. I wanted to hate her, but how could I, when she was just another victim of his lies? We talked for hours. She showed me messages, photos, proof of his manipulation. He had told her the same stories he told me, that he was overworked, lonely, misunderstood. He'd crafted 2 versions of himself, and we'd both fallen for the one that wasn't real. By the end of that meeting, something had changed again, not just between me and Clara, but inside both of us. We weren't enemies. We were survivors of the same betrayal. And that's when the idea was born. We were going to take him down. Together. Excellent. I continued the full script in the same first-person, modern urban, cinematic revenge voice. I kept the pacing, hooks, and emotional beats you asked for, and moved us through the full arc. Set up right arrow conflict, right arrow betrayal, right arrow alliance, right arrow revenge plan, right arrow execution, right arrow climax, right arrow resolution, right arrow moral. Because this is a long cinematic piece, I've divided it into 10 numbered sections with short subheadings. Each section reads like ready-to-record voiceover narration. I work to maintain suspense, cliffhangers, and a satisfying ending where justice is served and the protagonist gains closure. Below is the continuation and completion of the script. If you want a downloadable file, trimmed version, or further edits, tone, length, more twists, tell me and I'll adapt immediately. I remember the cafe like a scene frozen in amber, steam curling from our cups, the hum of other people's lives, and us sitting on opposite sides of a small table, deciding to become partners in something that felt dangerous and honest all at once. Clara and I had been strangers who shared a name on his phone and the same cracked feeling in our chests. But there was one thing that made her different from how I initially pictured the other woman. She wasn't arrogant. She wasn't a villain. She was, in her own way, as torn apart as I was. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, fingers wrapped tight around her coffee. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. I thought of the countless nights I had pretended not to notice, of the way Ethan's lies had been smoothed into excuses. I thought of the power of truth and how often it came late. "Yes," I said, "we do this together, not to ruin him, just to hurt him, to expose him, to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." We set a few rules, like an agreement between soldiers before a mission. No rash moves. No airing everything on the first day. We would collect facts, documents, receipts, copies of messages, the kind of cold evidence that would stand up when the emotions were gone. We would move slowly. We would be quiet, efficient, precise. Clara had access to things I didn't. She was a freelancer who worked with companies all over the city. She knew how to read contracts, how to find client histories, and more importantly, how to disappear into the background when necessary. I had something she needed too: proximity. Ethan lived with me. He left his laptop unlocked occasionally. He had patterns. He made the same mistakes. Our first step was small but perfect. Gather his timeline. Where he had been for the last 6 months, which hotels he used, receipts, and which clients were covers for late nights. We made lists. We shared passwords, a strange intimacy. We promised to be honest with each other at every step, no matter how ugly the truth got. When I left the cafe, the weight of it settled on me. I felt like someone who had stepped into a dark alley with a flashlight and found, to their surprise, that they were not alone. There was courage inside me that I hadn't known was there. There was power in the silence between Clara and me. That night, I watched Ethan from the doorway as he laughed at something on his phone. He looked like the man I once married. I felt a small, cold satisfaction, and a new calm replaced the tremor of betrayal. This was now a plan. This was no longer consumed by helplessness. We established our first proof point, a hidden folder on my old laptop where we began collecting screenshots and receipts. Each item we added felt like a stitch sewing a long-ignored wound closed. Each new discovery didn't heal the pain, but it gave me clarity and control. Still, as we moved forward, I felt another, stranger feeling, an odd kinship with the woman who had once been my rival. We were both stitched by his lies, and together we were going to pull them apart. You'd think once you started looking, the mess would be obvious, a single pattern revealing itself. But deceit is a practiced craft. It has layers. Ethan had become a magician of small disappearances and careful explanations. We started small: hotel names, dates, odd expense codes on the bank statements. Then we found the bigger things: duplicate receipts, a second phone number, a placeholder email account he used to talk to clients and apparently to Clara. He had a careful vocabulary: late work, out of town, conference. He invented lives for himself that only someone dishonest could maintain. We discovered that his so-called clients included a private recruiter who arranged consultation nights at boutique hotels. The receipts were thinly disguised, but to the trained eye they told a clearer story. There were several overlapping patterns: hotels booked under his maiden name, reservations at places with discreet check-ins, and then a shock: a message thread where Ethan had written, "She's more trouble than the contract, but she's worth it." That line was the key. It wasn't just romance. It was manipulation. He had used work as currency, a robe of respectability to hide other transactions. People ask how you feel when proof lines up so clearly. For me, there was a cold clarity at first, the kind of rational detachment that comes when you're collecting evidence in order to survive. But it didn't take long before anger crept back. Anger at the simplicity of his deceit, at the way he'd built a double life with the ease of a man who believed rules didn't apply to him. Clara and I compared notes, late into the nights. She'd forward screenshots. I'd pull up bank statements and cross-check hotel addresses on maps. We mapped his movements like detectives. We began to recognize his rituals: a call at 9 p.m., an undetectable hour where he slipped into someone else's life. We started to see him less as the charming husband and more as an actor who had perfected a role meant to keep us both at arm's length. Then we found something we didn't expect: a voicemail on his old phone from a woman who sounded panicked. She mentioned being left holding everything and that she had paid for favors. That phrase, favors, set our teeth on edge. Suddenly, the story widened. This was not merely a romance. It was leverage. We realized he hadn't only lied to us emotionally. He'd used money to keep people quiet. That one inference changed everything. Ethics and survival began to tangle in our minds. We had to be careful. If he had financial hooks into other people, exposing him could have consequences beyond our marriage. We adjusted our plan. We needed to protect ourselves. We documented. We anonymized. We found an encrypted email service and set up an account under a name that was ours alone, accessible only through a secure browser. We were no longer just two women out to hurt a man. We were two people trying to unravel a network of deceit while keeping our heads above water. And in the middle of this messy, ugly detective work, something strange happened. The anger softened into a determined calm. This wasn't about revenge as much as it was about stopping a pattern. The more we dug, the clearer the picture. Ethan had been leveraging affection and trust to get what he wanted. And the more people he used, the more dangerous he became. We were no longer just collecting proof for ourselves. We were building a case that could matter for others who might be hurt later. The stakes grew bigger than me, bigger than my marriage. The mission found purpose. When you plot something like this, the first rule is always the same. Don't get emotional at the wrong moment. A plan is a machine. If one part misfires because of emotion, the whole thing can collapse. Clara had a gift for turning emotion into strategy. She made a list of outcomes we wanted. Expose him publicly, ensure he could not rebuild the same lie easily, and make our dignity matter more than his control. The plan had 3 parts: evidence, exposure, and consequences. Evidence we'd already started compiling. Exposure required a stage. Consequences meant creating a ripple that would prevent him from simply moving on. We decided our exposures carefully. Social media could be messy, and while it would satisfy immediate emotions, it could backfire legally. We chose a safer route, a private meeting with a lawyer who specialized in fraud and infidelity-related damages. We prepared copies of the messages, hotel receipts, the duplicate accounts, and crucially, the financial transactions we were sure were linked to hush arrangements. The lawyer's office felt like stepping into an arena. Her face was calm and professional. She told us the truth in clear, legal language. Infidelity isn't always illegal, but deception tied to financial transactions, falsifying business records, or using company funds for personal liaisons could open legal doors. There were risks, especially if witnesses were reluctant to come forward. We also needed a vantage point to show him publicly where it would matter, at his work, where his reputation was tight and brittle. Ethan had built a reputation as a trustworthy consultant and a loving family man. His hubris had a lot to lose. We decided that a reputational strike would hurt him more than anything else. So we planned our public exposure to align with his biggest upcoming presentation, a corporate pitch where clients, colleagues, and leaders would be present. Finally, the pressure component. We designed a way to nudge people connected to him to speak without forcing them. Anonymous emails with links to our evidence, gentle nudges to the HR department of the company he consulted with, and a package to one of his clients. A printed dossier with highlights of our findings, addressed simply, "For your attention, he is not what he appears." It was calculated, surgical even. We decided on the day, the method of delivery, the timing, and how we'd be seen not as angry ex-wives, but as credible sources with evidence. There was an ethical debate between us. Was it right to cause someone's career to collapse? But the weight of what he had done, the people he had manipulated, the money he had used to keep them quiet, made the decision feel necessary. Justice, we decided, would be proportional. I felt a strange thrill as we put the pieces into place. We were no longer victims. We were architects of the truth. I practiced my words for when the world turned its head toward us. I practiced being calm, being factual, and letting the evidence do the emotional work for both of us. On the morning of his big pitch, Clara and I met before dawn, coffee in hand, hearts racing. We watched as messages were sent and packages were delivered. We waited, the way you wait for a slow-release storm. The oppressor had built his life on the assumption that he could control the narrative. That morning, we set out to pull the rug out from under him. It's almost a fable how quickly a facade can crumble. Ethan's pitch hall was full of people who trusted him, investors, colleagues, and an audience of people who saw him as polished and unassailable. He took the stage, smiling, all smooth hands and confidence. At first, nothing happened. My stomach twisted into knots. Maybe the packages were lost. Maybe we'd misread something. Then a whisper moved through the room like a wave. A woman from the client's office stood up halfway through his presentation and asked him a question that had nothing to do with the slide deck. She asked, calmly, if he had ever used company funds to pay for personal services. The question was clinical, not accusatory. Ethan froze. Around the room, people shifted. The sound of his voice changed, a crack in the mask. One by one, other clients pulled out their copies of the dossier we'd sent. The lawyer called the firm's HR during the meeting. An anchor in the back row had been given a copy by a friend. She raised her hand and asked a direct question. The tidy audience that had come to hear strategy was now watching a human portrait of someone who'd used charm as currency. Ethan tried to control it. He laughed, he refuted. He stumbled into explanations that fell like brittle paper. Evidence kept surfacing, hotel receipts, email exchanges, a secondary contract that never existed on his primary client's books. The more he moved to defend himself, the more tangled he became. Those small lies he'd used so effortlessly now dug him deeper. I sat in the back. My hands were cold, and my chest felt like it had grown a new, understanding bone. I watched him look around the room, his face a portrait of disbelief and mortal fear. He looked at me for a mere second, the look of a man who suddenly realized that a life built on falsehood can't hide behind charm forever. After the meeting ended, it wasn't over yet. HR asked Ethan to stay. He was escorted into a conference room where, I later learned, the lawyer we had briefed arrived with an investigator. The firm launched an internal inquiry. The clients questioned their contracts. A few journalists who had been tipped off began to ask questions. It was brutal, but it was not a spectacle of hate. We wanted him to be held accountable, not humiliated. That distinction mattered. The evidence did the work. None of it relied on emotional accusations. It relied on cold facts we had collected over months. Facts are harder to deny than feelings. When the first public announcement was made that week, a partnership paused and an internal review launched. Ethan's professional world began to leak air. He called me frantic, trying to weave a narrative, begging me to come home. He sounded small. For someone who had always relied on my sympathy, it was a strange and powerful moment to be the one steady hand in the storm. I didn't pick up. Clara and I watched as his reputation unraveled at work. There were voicemail messages from people he'd used, old contacts suddenly feeling emboldened. The more the investigation moved forward, the more likely it became that his lies would be officially recorded. Yet complications arrived like bad weather. Ethan responded by pushing the sympathy game at home, trying to appeal to the image of a loving father and husband. He reached out, staged apologies, and even arranged a dinner where he performed remorse. It was messy. He tried every tactic to regain control. But the truth, our truth, was public now, and his options narrowed. That was the moment when revenge felt less like wrath and more like a clearing. I felt vindicated, yes. But more than that, I felt relief. I could breathe because I wasn't alone anymore. Something larger than our small private pain had been set in motion, and it would keep others safer. Winning is never tidy. Even the most carefully planned actions create ripples, and not all of them land where you expect. As the public and professional fallout continued, other people from Ethan's life came forward, not because they wanted to, but because the evidence gave them permission. An assistant who'd been paid irregularly to change receipts showed us messages we hadn't seen. A client who'd felt awkward about a reimbursement suddenly felt free to ask questions. Some of these stories were ugly in ways I wasn't ready for. There were people who had been hurt in ways that couldn't be fixed with an apology or an investigation. There were also collateral victims, people whose careers touched Ethan, who suddenly felt the tremor of association. We had to hold our hands up to that reality and accept that exposure could hurt more than the target. Most unexpectedly, our alliance with Clara drew scrutiny. People asked why we hadn't gone to the company earlier. Critics suggested our motives were selfish. It stung, but Clara and I had to remind ourselves why we had acted, not for revenge alone, but to stop a pattern. There's no perfect path through betrayal. There's only the path you choose. Within the family sphere, it was complicated. Ethan tried to manipulate our mutual friends, painting the story as a smear campaign. He used language that invited sympathy. People who didn't know the full picture were conflicted. Some took his side initially. That was one of the toughest parts, seeing people you trusted hesitate when confronted with facts because deception is a persuasive performer. Still, there were small victories. One by one, those who'd been used felt liberated enough to speak. A woman who had once been paid to change receipts texted me saying, "I'm sorry, I was scared." Her message didn't fix things, but it confirmed the pattern. Another colleague wrote to HR, apologizing for not noticing earlier signs. And then there was Ethan's own reaction. He began to spin desperation into grand gestures, promises of therapy, and declarations of innocence. At times, he'd cry. At others, he'd rage. But the law and the firm's inquiry moved more slowly than the public's judgment. Procedural timeframes meant we still had to wait for formal consequences. During that waiting, life kept happening. Clara and I returned to normal tasks, work, bills, groceries, and each time we passed through a supermarket with satisfied composure, it felt like walking in a world that had been rearranged for our safety. Sometimes we'd laugh about how strange it was to be friends with someone who had been our other. Sometimes we'd sit in silence and feel grief for what had been lost. The most painful collateral was the children involved, his niece whom he'd helped tutor, the casual friends who had been unaware of the lies. Protecting them became part of our moral compass. We resolved to expose only what was necessary, the pattern, the lies, the money, and to shield anyone who had been tangentially affected by the fallout. One night, after months of hearings and inquiries, a message arrived from someone I never expected to hear from: Ethan's mother. Her voice was quiet on the voicemail. She said she didn't know what he had become and asked for understanding. In that moment, I felt complicated mercy. People were getting hurt, yes, but perhaps this exposure would force him to look in ways he never had before. There are moments when the machine you've started moves faster than you expect. For us, that moment came when the investigation concluded that Ethan's behavior had indeed involved misuse of client funds and falsifying expense reports. The firm suspended him pending further legal review. A few clients withdrew support. The press began to pick up the story beyond the business pages. When I read the official statement, my hands shook. It was formal, sanitized, and clinical, the language of institutions trying to be fair and cautious. But between the lines was justice. He couldn't walk around in his old life anymore. The suspension, the legal inquiries, and the evidence we had compiled had done what we intended. Ethan's first response was denial, then bargaining, then anger. He tried to shame us, to use our alliance against us, to call us liars and conspirators. But the weight of documents, signed receipts, and witnesses made his denials sound thin. Even his most loyal colleagues had to admit that the facts were not in his favor. When the firm released a second, firmer statement citing financial misconduct, the board convened a vote. He resigned, claiming he could not fight baseless accusations. The resignation sounded like the end of a man who'd once been comfortable in public light, but could not survive scrutiny. Even then, I felt a strange hollowness. I had expected more emotion, a moment of triumph so vivid it would erase the pain. That day, what filled me was a quiet, careful satisfaction. He was no longer in the center. He was no longer the man who could bend people with charm. But what replaced that loss for me was not joy. It was the steady reclaiming of my life. We had succeeded in exposing him, yes, but the consequences were deeper. His clients' trust had been broken. People who had partnered with him felt betrayed. Some asked us if we expected him to be punished. Others asked whether we were satisfied. The questions weren't simple. In court of public opinion, we had done what we could. Privately, the law had to do its work. The firm referred the matter to authorities. The evidence we had provided was used in investigative interviews, and the financial trail was now a matter for professionals to untangle. One night, when we thought it might be safe, Ethan came by the apartment. He wanted to talk. He stood on the doorstep, looking smaller than I remembered. He offered apologies, promises of change, and a sincere, desperate hope that we could all go back. There was a time when I might have believed him, but that time had passed. I told him the truth, plainly and without flourish. I told him the partnership was over, that trust could not be rebuilt from a foundation of lies. He heard it, silent and hollow. He left, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was space that allowed me to breathe again. That silence was the beginning of a life I hadn't allowed myself to imagine, one where my dignity wasn't negotiated away for the sake of an appearance. After the storm, life tends to look both ordinary and new: groceries, laundry, morning coffee, wrapped in a strange afterglow. The apartment was quieter. Ethan had moved out. He had taken a temporary place elsewhere, claiming the need for reflection. I suspected there was little reflection and more damage control. Clara and I kept meeting, but our meetings changed. They were less about evidence and more about life. We laughed at things that had once felt unbearable. We forged a friendship out of an experience that would have broken most people. That friendship felt like an artifact of our shared survival. The firm's legal process continued, and while we had accomplished the most important thing, exposure, there remained cross-currents. People still asked why I hadn't left earlier. I answered the same way I always had. Love can be a slow teacher. It took time for me to gather the strength to choose truth over comfort. My work resumed, slowly: emails, client calls, meetings. There were awkward interactions, glances that had new meaning, and a few who treated me like a cautionary tale. But most of the time, people treated me like someone who had survived. One of the most healing moments came unexpectedly. A woman messaged me on social media, a stranger saying, "I saw what you did. Thank you." She told me that she was in a situation where a colleague used charm to accomplish things, and seeing us expose Ethan helped her leave a dangerous situation. It was a small message, but it felt enormous. Sometimes the greatest justice is when your actions protect someone else. Rebuilding trust took time. Trust in myself first. I learned to listen to my instincts again. I set boundaries. And I built a life where my voice could be heard clearly and not muffled by the noise of someone else's need. There were moments of doubt nights where I wondered if we could have handled things differently, if we had been crueler than necessary. Those were the nights I called Clara, and we reassured each other. We had been honest. We had tried to avoid collateral harm. We had done our best. Ethan tried to come back into my life in small ways. Messages, an arranged meeting where he tried to barter for understanding. Each time I listened, then refused. Forgiveness, I learned, was not an automatic right. It's a gift, given when the giver truly understands the cost of their deceit, and of ours, the cost of confronting it. In the months after his resignation, he faded from the parts of our lives that truly mattered. That absence, strangely, was healing. Where once his presence had been a heavy cloud that shaded everything I did, his absence allowed the light back in. If this story has a moral, it's not a neat, pious line you find at the end of a movie. Life is never that simple. But if I had to speak plainly, here is what I learned. First, truth demands courage. It's easy to be angry. It takes more strength to be methodical, to gather evidence, to think of consequences and of others. Clara and I did not act out of pure vengeance. We acted because a pattern of deceptive behavior needed to be stopped. We turned pain into action, not to trap, but to prevent. Second, betrayal does not make you weak. It changes you. Yes, there was a time when I felt like a shell of myself. But once I began taking steps, I realized agency returns gradually, with evidence, with clear boundaries, with honest conversations. The day I stopped pretending and started planning, I found my voice again. Third, people are rarely pure villains or saints. Clara was not the other woman in any simple sense. She was also deceived. Ethan was not all evil in a cartoonish way. He had charm, momentary tenderness, and selfishness. Life is messy. The clarity comes when you separate actions from the idealized versions of people. Someone's kindness does not excuse their abuse. Fourth, alliances can be unexpected. The woman who once represented betrayal became my ally. There's power in choosing unlikely friends when faced with injustice. The world will shape you, but you can choose who stands with you while you shape it back. Finally, justice is more than exposure. It's about protecting others, being conscientious about collateral harm, and practicing mercy when appropriate. Exposing the truth is essential when lies become tools for exploitation. But we must also learn to rebuild with integrity. As for me, I moved forward. I dated slowly, remembering what it felt like to be trusted without theatrics. I rebuilt my home. I found joy in small things, walking at dusk, new books, the satisfaction of honest work. I forgave myself for not seeing the signs earlier because I had to. Forgiveness for myself was not surrendering to his choices. It was giving myself the freedom to rebuild. Clara and I still text sometimes. We have a ritual, an annual dinner, a quiet toast to the truth and the strange way it saved us. We check in with people who have been hurt, lending an ear or a message of support. We try, in our quiet way, to make the world a little safer for the next person. If you take anything away from this, let it be this. When you find yourself in the dark, look for the allies you might not expect. Honor the evidence, not the image. And remember that exposure, when wielded carefully and justly, can protect people who cannot protect themselves. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. He lost more than a job. He lost the comfortable permission his lies gave him. We won something else, not just revenge, but the return of a life that belonged to me. And in a city full of second chances, that felt like victory enough.